Today, Trinity is 103 years old. And we have seen good times and we've seen bad times. There were good times when this building was bursting at the seams with over 500 in worship each weekend. There were good days when we had Sunday school, even just confirmation classrooms that outnumbered our whole Sunday school attendance, sometimes even our worship attendance today. And there were sad times when our church body was in peril and our brothers and sisters, maybe sometimes even in this congregation, were divided by their allegiance to Scripture. There were sad times when we sometimes forgot that this is a family. This is not a civic club. This is not a human organization. There were sad times when our now growing and thriving preschool was barely hanging on, meeting in the dark, dank old basement in a little room, feeling totally disconnected from the rest of the congregation. But none of those times, both good and bad, none of those times are these times. These times are what demand our attention tonight. My shop teacher in 7th grade was Mr. Aurelius. Remember Sergeant Carter from Gomer Pyle? That was Mr. Aurelius. Pretty sure he was a retired Marine drill instructor. He had the flat top haircut and everything, and he would literally march into the classroom every day, and he would bellow at the top of his lungs, "Straighten up, people! You're going to learn something today." And when he did that, you know what? I always sat bolt upright in my desk, and I paid attention. I did that because, one, Mr. Aurelius was scary. And two, Mr. Aurelius spoke as one who had authority. And I really believed that I was going to learn something that day. Jesus is a lot like Mr. Aurelius. He says in our gospel today, "Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." You ever notice how people like to talk about the end of the world, but no one acts like it's really coming? Nobody in the church or out of the church really anticipates that any of that bad stuff is going to happen. And when it does happen, they want to find someone to blame. If not someone human, then they want to blame God. And I got to tell you, these students of Jesus, they really weren't A students. They really hadn't paid very much attention to Jesus. I mean, any teacher knows that there's a difference between a student who really is getting into the material and a student who's just doing whatever is necessary, going through the motions in order to pass the class. And Jesus is letting those C and D students here know that what's coming their way is not for the faint-hearted. It's not for the less attentive student. This is difficult material that is going to require their full attention. If you wanted an easy A, you didn't take Mr. Aurelius. There was another shop teacher. You could go to his class and he had you build a birdhouse from a kit. Mr. Aurelius used wood shop to teach life lessons, to mold us into good students, to form us into upstanding citizens. Likewise with Jesus. If we want puppies and sunshine, I think we picked the wrong rabbi. Have you ever seen cows let out of the barn for the first time in spring when the snow has just melted? I'm not a very rural guy, but I get all of my rural ideas from YouTube. And there are these videos on YouTube that show this. They let these cows out of the barn, and these cows are literally dancing around in this new grass of spring. Well, look at the prophet Malachi tonight in our Old Testament reading. He uses that very imagery to describe what it's going to be like for Christians on the day of the resurrection. It will be as though we had been locked in a stuffy old barn for a long, cold winter and finally let out into the new and perfect world. Meanwhile, while we were in the barn, Malachi talks about what happens to the arrogant and the evildoers. He talks about them being thrown into a burning oven. And you and I will dance on their ashes like young cattle let loose from their stalls. Jesus, however, is also specific that long, cold winter in that stuffy barn is not going to be a picnic. It's going to be a challenge for us. It is a challenge for us. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences, and there will be signs and sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the Black Plague, Chernobyl, Holocaust, tsunamis, earthquakes, global warming, superbugs. Are these signs of the end? Most certainly. And it's going to get worse before it gets over. Straighten up, people. Lift up your heads and pay attention. Because our time as the church on this earth is no picnic. And it was never meant to be one. God is sending trial after trial to teach human beings that we are not in control. And that He is God. And why do we have to suffer these atrocities? Jesus answered that too. But before all this, they'll lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. Straighten up, people. We live in a dying world. In our 103 years, times have gotten harder and harder for the church on earth. We witness our Lord allowing the world that He so gloriously created slowly decompose and die all around us in order to bring people to their knees. We are very much like God's people enslaved in Egypt, who watched the 10 plagues ravage the great nation of Egypt until the firstborn of every Egyptian family and herd was slaughtered. And finally, the Pharaoh fell to his knees. And just as they gathered together that night to eat the Passover meal and to remember that God will always deliver us, so we gather together to eat the very body and blood of Christ. The very body and blood of Christ which did deliver us. Straighten up, people. Lift up your heads. We have already been delivered from this sin-infested dung pile. But there is work to be done. There's work to be done before we leave. So stand firm in your faith and loudly proclaim the God you worship. The times are only going to get worse, and there are many people who need to hear that Christ has rescued them. The world is dying. The church on earth is dying. This congregation will surely die as well. It's only by the grace of God, absolutely miraculous, that we have lasted 103 years. Death is all around us. But that baptismal water runs down our foreheads as we cross through here to receive that very body and blood of Christ. That very body and blood of Christ that reminds us that even though death is all around us, we live forever. Not someday we will live forever. We live forever right now. That's why the death of this sinful world does not frighten us, does not alarm us, because this world's death only ushers us into paradise more quickly. So when calamity after calamity comes like waves of the ocean, slowly beating this world to pieces, straighten up, lift up your heads, and rejoice, for your salvation is near.